attacked, intentional, repurpose.
Hi, everyone. This is Heather Vickery, and you've tuned in to the Brave Files podcast, where we share stories from people who have stepped out of fear and into bravery in every possible way. We are here to create a revolution of people who are recognizing and choosing what I affectionately call everyday brave. Just like success, bravery is self-defined. One of the ways we can choose bravely is by practicing some serious self-love, and that's why I'm excited to share a brand new podcast with you that my friend Lily is hosting. It's called Self-Love 365, and it's a daily podcast that's chronicling Lily's self-love practice for, you guessed it, a full 365 days. Listening to it is a little voyeuristic and a lot of fun. And I love this show because it's filled with practical items that help you level up your self-love game on the spot. Each episode is 10 to 15 minutes long, so it's bite-sized. It's a little bite-sized bit of joy to start your day off with. If you're living your ideal life, but you still feel depleted or overwhelmed at the end of the day, Self-Love 365 can help. If your self-care routines have gotten stale or ceased to exist, Self-Love 365 can help. If you give more to others than you're able or willing to give to yourself, Self-Love 365 can help. The episodes are short and you can binge them and catch up quickly. Listen every day or catch up on the weekends. I especially love episode 13 because it's all about learning to love the self you've become, even when that may not be the person you thought you'd be. Listen, folks, times are tough, and the only way forward is through LOVE. Start by loving yourself, and start by listening to Self-Love 365. You can find the podcast on Anchor or Spotify or anywhere you're currently getting your podcast fixed. This week marks the 20th anniversary of the horrific 9/11 attacks, and we're still seeing heartbreaking and devastating ripple effects across the globe. That's why today I'm replaying an episode that originally aired on 9/11/2019. It's an interview I did with 9/11 first responder Mike Cortez. I reflect on Mike's story often, his courage in telling such a personal, painful experience, his willingness to show how he has navigated survivor's guilt and uses what he has, his strengths and his powers, to help others find their own purpose through his own journey in finding his purpose. Mike's story is heartbreaking, but also beautiful, and it's filled with so many poignant, wonderful moments. I am really honored that Mike chose to share his story with me, that he allowed me to be a vessel for getting his voice out and sharing this incredible journey. And I'm honored to reshare this interview with you now. 18 years ago today, the world changed forever. The attacks of 9/11 took the lives of thousands and forever altered the lives of millions, literally all over the world. Today, we honor the victims and the heroes of the tragedy. Today, I'm joined by a man who was a young firefighter from New York City when the attacks happened. We'll talk about his experiences that day, how his life changed forever, and why he feels it's important to share his story now and work together to build a healthier, more loving, welcoming, and accepting worldwide community. This is Heather Vickery, and you're listening to The Brave Files, stories from people living courageously. When we choose bravely in big and small ways, it powerfully elevates our lives. I hope these stories connect with you and encourage you to embrace bravery in every possible way, day after day. Together, we can build a movement of courageous living that enriches both our lives and our communities. And if you enjoy the show, I ask you to please share it with others. Maybe think of someone who you want to choose bravely right alongside you. Thanks for tuning in. Now here's the show. You know, this is the Brave Files. This show's about bravery, and sometimes we talk about the smallest and the most unusual forms of bravery. Today, though, is not one of those days. The morning of September 11th, 2001, I went to work like most people I knew. And almost as soon as I arrived, I heard someone say a plane hit the World Trade Center. And like most people at the time, we thought it was an accident. And we all gathered around to watch the news. Well, you all know what happened after that. Ooh, this is hard pre-roll. This is hard to do, friends. My heart is pounding out of my chest. Today, I'm honored to have Mike Cortez with me. Mike was a firefighter in New York City when the attacks happened. And he's here to share his story and how he's grown and how this has impacted his entire life. Mike, welcome to the Brave Files.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
Okay, really, I never get myself like this as I'm doing an intro to a show, but this is perhaps the biggest, most impactful, world-altering experience that's happened in most of our lives.
Yeah, it definitely.
And I didn't experience it the way you experienced it. So just preparing to talk to you about it, woo. So happy to have you here. Thank you for being willing to come on and share your story with us.
It's an honor. I really do appreciate it. And I think you're excellent at what you do.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. So let's get a little bit of background. Our listeners already know you were there for the attacks. How long had you been in the fire department before they happened?
So I was a brand new firefighter. I just graduated from The Rock, which is
Tell us what that is.
Yeah, they call it The Rock, but basically it's the New York City Fire Department's fire academy.
Okay.
It's kind of like going through boot camp.
Okay.
And I just graduated there about March, so 2001.
In March, so just a few months. How old were you?
I think it was 20. It's a good question. I think maybe 21, 22.
21. Man, that's a baby.
Yeah.
I remember being 21. I certainly didn't feel like a grown-up about to deal with what you dealt with. Tell us, again, just kind of collecting some background information. Tell us about the days leading up to 9/11. You were supposed to be working that day, right?
Yeah. So the days leading up to 9/11 were actually pretty exciting. I felt like I had just achieved one of the biggest goals in my life of becoming a New York City firefighter. The rest of my life looked solid. It looked secure. And I was pretty much on cloud nine.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, it is like boot camp. It's intense. And this is something you expected to do for the rest of your life.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So tell us why were you not working that morning?
So being in the fire academy, I sat next to a guy who was also short because of my huge stature of 5'6". The guy next to me was short, and we became pretty good friends. And I had one of the goals that I had at the top of my mind to graduate, fire academy was I was going to buy myself a 4-wheeler and just enjoy the outdoors. So I was hoping to sell my friend Rich on getting a 4-wheeler as well too.
So you could go out and do that together.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you what, from March until about September 8th, we just could never get it to work. It never worked out for whatever reason. And I kind of almost just gave up. And it was about September 8th or so, a few days before September 11th, I get a call from Rich. And he said, "Hey, Mike, listen, let's do it. Let's do it on Tuesday, the 11th. I said, "Man, I'm working. I can't do it." He just persisted, and I was a little bit frustrated because here I am now having to change my schedule when he wasn't able to do it. But after about 30 minutes of intense persuasion, I finally decided, all right, let me call my shift partner, who he also knew from our training academy. And I said, "Jimmy, hey man, do you mind if I work Wednesday instead of Tuesday?" And for him, his schedule was pretty tight, but that was the only day that we had scheduled. He said, "Hey, it doesn't matter, Tuesday or Wednesday." So I just changed it at the last minute.
So I literally have chills just hearing that. The universe works in really unknown and mysterious ways. And I know that, well, I don't know. I don't know anything about how you feel. I can only assume how you feel, but you were meant to not be there that morning. Have you sat with that? Like, he persisted, he pushed. Have you spent time thinking like, okay, this happened for a reason?
Yeah, that was kind of initially where my mind went. Okay, I'm here for a reason. family members would say, wow, God spared you. And then going into the firehouse and thinking, well, what about my buddies who died? Did he not spare them? Is that how that happened? And I did wrestle with that for a while. And I went through this process of thinking my life was spared to really questioning,
why
is that what happened?
Yeah.
And then kind of coming to the realization, what I discovered about 3 days after the September 11th.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll talk about that. I can only imagine there were and are continue to be conflicting emotions around all of that. Okay. So you switched days, and so you're home the morning of 9/11. How did you learn about the attack?
I got a phone call from my girlfriend at the time who said, Mike, turn on the TV. A plane just hit the Trade Center. And turn on the television, and I saw what we all saw.
Yeah. So were you like me? Were you watching when the second plane hit?
Yeah. So I was watching the TV in complete disbelief. My parents had just moved to Orlando, Florida. I called my parents and I said, you guys have to stop wherever you are. I don't know if they were playing racquetball or whatever, but I said, you got to stop. Even though they knew about it, I said, this is no small Cessna. Mm-hmm. And we began to kind of think about all the friends we knew who worked in the Trade Center. So immediately that went through our mind, of course. And then sure enough, the second plane hit. And my dad instantly said, that's terrorism.
Yeah. I'll never forget that, watching that.
Where were you that morning?
So I was at work. I worked at a local hotel. I was in social events and weddings. And at a hotel, you have like a group kitchen, not a kitchen, but everybody eats, so a big lunchroom and all of that. And there are TVs, and that's literally everyone. And we got put on lockdown. Again, I won't begin to compare my experience to that of somebody who was in New York City at the time, or even DC. But
Heather, let me say something. This is really what's interesting. Whenever we talk about September 11th, it is so moving. Everybody remembers exactly where they were, exactly how they felt. And we were all really experienced that trauma. So, your story, you have a story as well there too.
Thank you for that. We were put on lockdown, and we were right next to the Board of Trade. That's where my hotel was. Okay. And my boyfriend at the time, who is now my ex-husband, he worked in the Board of Trade. And once, like you, we realized this was a terror attack. First of all, we had guests who wanted to get out. They couldn't get out. Every rental car, every limo, everything was booked solid. And we were on lockdown. Like, you're not going home until these guests get to go home. But we were really, truly afraid that a plane was headed to Chicago to hit another large, in the Sears Tower. I was next to the Board of Trade in the Sears Tower.
Got it.
And, subsequently, I think we've learned that may have been part of the plan if the planes hadn't been grounded. So, and then just watching the news. So, Mike, take us then from that moment where you're talking to your dad and you have this realization. Take us through some of your day.
Well, once Dad said that, now I'm completely in disbelief. Anytime I bring friends up from college who wanted to see New York, the World Trade Center, they always went to the Trade Center, right? And I was so
iconic.
I was enamored by the size of these buildings when you used to drive by them. And
everyone was
massive. So I lived in Staten Island at the time, which is one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I have got to get to a place where I can actually see this with my own eyes. So I jump in the car, and as I start heading out to one of the higher spots on Staten Island, I could see the smoke, but I couldn't see what would have been the whole World Trade Center area. And while I'm driving, listening to the news, one of the news reporters says, "Oh my God, I think one of the towers just collapsed."
Oh my God.
And instantly I was angry, not at the fact that a tower could have collapsed, but more or less of her thinking that she's probably saying this to boost her ratings. There's no way that those towers, would come down. And she just kept on kind of affirming that she couldn't see it. So then I made a U-turn, went back home, turned the television on, and I too couldn't see where the tower was. And then on the way home, I heard over the radio an announcement come over. It said, all off-duty New York City firefighters and police officers, you're to report to work immediately. A major disaster has just occurred in Lower Manhattan. And so now here I am at home thinking, okay, I got to roll. I got to get into work. But I couldn't get into Manhattan because if you remember, Manhattan, just like you guys were locked down, they locked down Manhattan. Bridges and tunnels were all shut down.
Absolutely. So how did you get through? Showing your badge? Or?
Well, my brother was a fireman as well too, and he said, "Hey," I called him up, and he said, "Look, I'm going to head into Brooklyn, and I want you to head into division headquarters in Staten Island. That's where we were going to. Each borough has a division headquarters."
Right.
So I get in, and here we are, looking at just the television, waiting for orders from the chief. Chief came down, and he said, "Okay, guys, we're going to go to the Staten Island Ferry Terminal, which is a major thoroughfare where a lot of commuters commute all the time to Manhattan."
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be a triage unit for all these bodies that are going to be coming over.
Ooh.
So essentially everyone's going to be coming over. We're going to be either treating them or determining who's, worse off than the others. And we got down there, and now I didn't have any fire gear, by the way. They said, "Oh, they'll have stuff down there for you."
Okay.
I took a big bunker coat, which was a little over 2 sizes too big for me probably. But I got down there, and the first ferry came over, and I can't remember if there was a lot of people on it or not, but I just remember there was people that were covered in soot, but the people's faces were just in shock. And we waited a little bit longer for another boat to come, and nobody's ever came over. So some of us who were stationed in Manhattan said, "Look, we want to know what's going on with our guys." Now, honestly, I didn't think my guys were down there because you've been to Manhattan before, I'm sure, right?
Yep.
We were right around the block from Central Park South. But I had worked in the village, and one of the firehouses down there is more concerned with. So the chief finally said, "Anybody who's got a station in Manhattan, you can head on over."
Okay.
So as I board the ferry, I look up and I see the ferry boat captain. Ironically, I knew him from church, and his daughter and I went to youth group together. And I knew she worked at the 95th floor. I think it was Cantor Fitzgerald, of the first tower that was hit.
Oh, God. Yeah.
So he saw me. I couldn't say anything but her name. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and I just said, "Cynthia." And he said, "Mike, thank God she was late today."
Oh.
And I thought, oh my gosh.
Chills all over.
And so we basically took the ferry over. It was a really quiet ride. We're watching smoke billowing from Lower Manhattan on this beautifully blue, crystal clear day, not a cloud in the sky. And once we get off the boat, as we proceed up the West Side Highway, which is the street essentially where the World Trade Center is, right in front of the Trade Centers, we're walking in about a foot of soot. And that was a real uncanny scene. The area that's normally bustling with traffic just filled with soot.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are you thinking at that moment as you're walking? You're through the soot, leaving footprints, I assume. What are your thoughts?
I was on the phone with my mom, and she's trying to get an idea of, hey, what's going on down there? And I'm describing the scene to her. And I'm also walking with one of the firemen who was in my firehouse. He was a senior guy, which means she had a lot more years on than I did. And we're walking up to where the trade centers are. And as we're walking, I'm looking around, and there's carnage everywhere. I mean, there's cars that were just flipped over from the sheer gust of the impact when the building collapsed.
Yeah.
I'll never forget. I saw a fire chief sitting down. Now you have to understand, typically when you're at a fire, the chief is like the coach. I mean, he's orchestrating everything. I mean, he total leadership. And here's this chief sitting there. He's sitting down. He's got his elbows resting on his knees, and his hands are cradling his head. And he just looks up, and you could just tell from the look of it that he just lost a bunch of guys, and he just don't even know what to do. And so we proceeded to walk up north. The sound of Scott packs, which are the air tanks that firemen wear on their back, are starting to, you can hear them blaring in the background.
Oh, wow. Are they trying to get air to people? What are they doing with the air tanks?
Yeah, so whenever a fireman enters a fire, they have what's called a Scott pack or an air tank on their back so they can breathe. And if you are motionless for a short period of time, it'll start to beep a little bit. But when you're motionless for more than, I don't know if it's a minute or so, it'll just whine. You probably hear it's like, be-do-be. You'll hear that. And so tons of them are going off. And
So
anytime you hear that at a fire scene, man down, you've got
there's a man down. So
right.
This is the sound of your fellow firefighters fighting for their lives.
Yeah, either that or just, I mean, yeah, or
gone.
Basically, yeah, exactly, or gone. So we continue walking up, and I walk under a collapsed footbridge, which was designed to bring pedestrians from one side of the highway to the other.
Okay.
And my friend Vinny and I look up, and we had no idea that our engine company would have been anywhere near there. And sure enough, there's my fire engine about 20 yards up, engine 23.
I know you say you look up and you see your own engine.
We see my own fire engine among a ton of first responder vehicles. I mean, typically it would have been hard to find an engine anyway at a fire scene, but it was right there. Windows blown out, doors open. It looked like the guys took everything and ran in. At
that moment, all your guys are there.
Well, I didn't know.
You didn't know.
There's something I feel like maybe it's almost like when something so tragic happens, the mind can't make sense of it yet. It can't.
Yeah.
So this was all still like, is this really happening? They'll be out of there if they were trapped in there. Just kind of, you're not really rationally thinking. I think that was a common thing that a lot of guys and I talked about afterwards. Well, out of the distance of all this fog and haze, I see one of the guys from my engine company. And I shout, thought he was a ghost at first, but I said, Tony. And Tony waves us down. He sees us and he's like, Mike. I said, bro, where are the guys? He said, they were all in there. And that's when we knew this is really bad. It was just a day where things kept on getting worse and worse and worse. And so immediately I said, well, let's go. Let's start looking. And remember, I don't know if I shared this with you, but I'm there in shorts,
right?
Sneakers, a blue fire department FDNY shirt, and this big bunker coat that barely fits me. So we start climbing up the pile, and I trip and I fall, and I fell on something that was kind of slippery and hollow. I was like, what is this? And I started to dust it off, and I realized I was standing on top of an ambulance.
Oh my God.
So when I stood up, I looked around and I realized this pile is really underneath us is all of the initial first responders that responded. And, you're thinking about the loss of life. You're thinking, if I get hurt, there's nobody, you're out, you're alone.
There's nobody else.
Done.
Yeah.
And so for the rest of that day, we essentially, a lot happened, but we really felt like ants on a pile of 2x4s. All we saw was smoke billowing from this, it looked like a junkyard wreckage of about 8 stories tall, twisted I-beams that were insanely thick, twisted like ribbons, elevated cable, and the aluminum that the building was framed in.
Were you on autopilot? Were you like, I got to save as many people as I can? Does any of it, did it just feel like you were like out of body? I don't know. How did you get through it?
That's a good question. I think when you're a fireman, you're trained to respond to scenes where people are running out. And, New York Fire Department, they're known as the bravest. And I certainly didn't feel brave that day. I was scared. And primarily because as you're searching around, you're looking for people. That's instinctively what you want to do.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to find any source of life, any sign of life. And I thought I found somebody. I saw a foot sticking out, and I want to be descriptive, but I want to be tactful here.
Yeah.
The amount of I would think you might see tons of body parts. It really wasn't like that. There just was nothing, but there was some of that every once in a while. And I saw a foot sticking out. I thought it was somebody might have been buried. And as I dug out, it wasn't. Mm. I remember looking at that foot, and it was a foot of a woman. She had nail polish on. It looked like she didn't even have a scar on it. And just thinking like, this is somebody's mother. This is somebody's sister. So it was difficult, but we kept on looking. Throughout the day, we got scares when people would think that another attack was coming, get notified that there's another plane coming. And sometimes you got notified that the buildings around you that were heavily damaged fact, one looked like Godzilla came in and just took a slash out of it. We're about ready to collapse. And you would look up and see these buildings we thought were going to collapse, and somebody would yell, "Run!" And there's no way you could run on this. Yeah. So that happened several times that day. But one of the things we did was we had to put the fire out. And when I'm going to share something too, maybe give you a little perspective. If you ever hear people talk about the conspiracy and how come there was no water and how did World Trade Center 7 collapse, there should have been sprinkler systems that should have suppressed that fire. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is when the towers came down, they came down with such tremendous force that it took out the water main. So all of the fire hydrants, we couldn't get water from the fire hydrants. The sprinklers obviously couldn't get water in let's say World Trade Center 7. So we actually had to get some guys to draft water from the river, connect all these hoses and start drafting water from the river to get water onto the fire.
Wow. This feels like such a weird question to ask. Were there a lot of fires, like actual burning flames to put out?
Yeah, it's not a weird question, actually. A lot, yes, but for what you would expect on that day, no. Right. There was fires on the piles periodically. There were scattered fires on the piles. World Trade Center 7 was a building that was burning right next to us. And I actually had walked around that building that day, and I think it was the 7th floor. So it's a 47-story building, I believe. The 7th floor was burning out of control.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why it eventually collapsed is because there's no water that's being suppressed on that fire, and eventually steel weakens and warps.
Right.
So if you got 40-something stories above a floor that's being compromised,
it can't hold
that's
it.
That's why it collapsed that way. I was right there when that collapsed. So
you were right there. What are you thinking, if you can recall, as you're watching that building collapse?
We heard a lot of cracks around that building, and it got to the point where the Chiefs ordered us kind of away from where World Trade Center 7 was, but we were very close to it. And then at one point you just heard this bunch of cracks and then followed by this rumble and just came down. But it came down pretty neatly, if you will, within that one spot. And that was shocking too.
Yeah.
Because we thought it would just kind of tip over, but I guess that's not how buildings collapse because of the immense weight.
Yeah. The engineering of that is fascinating. It's interesting how the folks who orchestrated this attack, they knew that was what's going to happen with the buildings. And like you, everyone else, we thought these buildings are indestructible. Oh my goodness. So how long are you at ground zero?
I was there till at least midnight that night. So I was there about an hour after the towers collapsed. I think it was like around 10 o'clock is when I think one of the first towers came down. So maybe I got down to about 11, and we were there till midnight. The rest of the day was just digging and looking. And by the time the day was ending, I shouldn't say it was ending, but by the time, midnight was happening, there was a line of people that were basically removing debris as a bucket brigade.
Yeah.
Removing debris because there was a survivor that was found and they were trying to extract them. So we were part of the bucket brigade.
Did you find survivors?
Me personally, I didn't. There really were not a lot of survivors. Yeah. But because the pile had been combed to a good amount that day and people knew that there was survivors there, everybody wanted to kind of pitch in and help.
Yeah.
And then I remember a neighbor coming out of nowhere, a New Yorker, bringing us peanut butter jelly sandwiches and just thinking, this is the best sandwich I ever had. And what a heart that this person has, If we just, New York all came together, it was beautiful.
Yeah. Were you surrounded by volunteers and community members at that point? I mean, so many first responders were already gone. Talk to me a little bit about seeing New York City come together and rise up there.
It's a good question. The unity that transpired the days, the weeks, the months after was unlike anything I'll ever forget.
Yeah.
So, here's an example. 3 days after September 11th, I went to go check out the firehouse that I used to work at in the village, is just to see specifically who was lost, because we really didn't know who was gone at that point.
Okay.
And as I walk by, I see the table with,
It's okay.
in front of a lot of firehouses, they would have a table with the pictures of those that were lost. And it was a lot of my good friends who mentored me. And so that was really hard. And I spent a lot of time at that firehouse that day. And before 9/11, I'll tell you a little story to talk about the unity. So have you been to the village in New York?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so you know the village, right? There was a woman that would come by the firehouse quite often, and she was dressed in pink all the time, pink hair, and she was called marijuana. She called herself Marijuana Barbie, a proponent of marijuana. And this is back when marijuana maybe wasn't legal, of course, way back then. She was super sweet, but I'll never forget that day, 3 days after the 11th, seeing neighbors in the street, Marijuana Barbie. It didn't matter who it was, homeless guy, like in the street holding hands, praying. I mean, they were so broken for the guys that were lost. And it was just, it didn't matter who you were, didn't matter what you looked like, didn't matter. It was just, we were all together, and that was instinctively what they wanted to do.
Mike, how many of the guys from your station were lost?
As we lost everybody that was working that day. There was about 6 guys. There's kind of a little caveat to that. It happened around the change of shifts.
Oh, wow.
So typically guys get in about an hour early, and it was 9 o'clock as the change of shifts, but everybody gets in an hour early, and we have breakfast. So usually you have 2 shifts on. So there's a lot more guys that died that day. There's 343 firemen that died that day.
Yeah.
And but from that firehouse, we lost all the guys that were working that day. And then from the firehouse I worked at downtown, all those guys. So it was a lot of guys.
Yeah, it's a lot of guys. And your friend that took the shift for you was among those.
Yeah, that's when I mentioned to you about Tony.
Yeah.
And me bumping into Tony. When he said they were in there, about 20 minutes later, it just hit me. Yeah. Oh my goodness, I had just changed my shift. Now, whenever you change your shift, you're worried that the guy, who you're switching shifts with might catch a big fire. As firemen, you want that, right? You're training for that. You're able to kind of help people. You don't want to sit around the firehouse. You really want to help people. Right. And so I thought, I'm going to go into work today. When I was at home, I thought I was going to go to work the next day, and they were going to break my chops because I missed the biggest fire. I changed my shift at the last minute, having no idea, the extent of everything. Yeah.
You were telling us when you arrived at the firehouse, the table was out. Are you able to go back and tell us that story?
Yeah. That was probably one of the most powerful events or moments I remember. I grew up in church, and I think I mentioned to you early on how my mom or other people would say, wow, you were spared. And then I began to think, well, what about my friends? What about my friend Jimmy, who took my spot, who had a fiance and a son? Really wrestling with these heavy questions. And I walked up to the firehouse, and when I saw those guys, I just, I broke down, and I just said, God, I just prayed. I was like, God, I don't understand. I don't understand. Like, you've got to make this clear to me. And instantly this verse came to my head, like, it's appointed for a man once to die and then face the judgment. And when I thought about that, I thought, we think we're given 75, 80, 90 years to live. We don't know when our time is up.
No, we don't.
I mean, people think when people die at 30 that they've died early. Well, maybe that was their time. Maybe that's all they were given. We can't make sense of it. I'm not going to pretend to make sense of it, but I just had this piece that, okay, we all have an appointed time, and it just wasn't my time. Yeah. So that's how I made sense of it.
Yeah. I'm sure that was not an easy thing to make sense of, but at some point, what I was going to say is at some point you have to just keep going. But I know that for some people that wasn't an option that they could they did not have the strength to do that.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful that you did. When you got home that night, what did you do?
I didn't want to go home
Yeah.
because we wanted to work, but we heard several of the chiefs saying, hey, anybody who's scheduled to work tomorrow, which was me, go home and get rest. You're going to need it because you're going to be here all day tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I wasn't going to go home, but they kept on pushing that. So we went home, and there was a lot of people there. We went home. My brother and I drove. There was a bus that they commandeered, and remember taking the Staten Island ferry and heading back, just sitting there with my brother. And I had an axe. I don't even know what I had in my hand. Something that I was going to bring back tomorrow. It was like a big flashlight and an axe that I had found. And just in disbelief, I got home and I don't even remember what I did. I mean, I showered and I was just probably in shock.
Absolutely. You had to be. What were the subsequent days and weeks like?
Hard, very hard. A lot of confusion initially. It was still just kind of disbelief that this all happened.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of guys did not want to, I don't know if they didn't want to face, or one of the ways they would lighten the gravity of what just happened was saying, oh, our guys are probably down there having a party somewhere. They're probably trapped somewhere. And, they'll, cause there were several several floors below the Trade Center. There's a mall down there, I believe. And it was a lot of confusion. We worked like 24 hours on, 24 hours off, 24 hours on, 24 hours off. But the hardest parts for, I think, us were dealing with the families and the funerals.
Yeah.
And those were pretty crushing.
How soon, this is such a morbid question, but how soon did they start having funerals? Because you were looking for people, you were looking for victims to bury, right? But you didn't find very many, did you?
No. And you're exactly right. The hard part was watching families wrestle with, do we have a memorial service or do we wait?
Yeah.
So many they really came to the point where we're going to have a memorial service. What became super hard is obviously being at the funerals. And I'll just tell you a story. There was a guy that I wasn't too fond of. As a new fireman, they break your chops.
Sure.
And I'm totally game for that. But this guy just, I don't know, we didn't gel too well together. And I kind of hated going to work when I was going to work with him. Everybody else we got along with. Well, he passed away that day. And I forget being at his funeral and seeing his two kids and just thinking, I hated this. I couldn't stand this guy, but I didn't hate him this much. I had no idea that he had two kids who were going to grow up now without a dad and a wife who's going to have to figure out how is she going to get along. And so I learned a very painful lesson, and the bitter person doesn't win in the end. I lost. Anyways, that was a hard part. The other challenges were when you'd have a family who would come to the realization of a memorial service. That's really hard to watch and be a part of. And then they might have a birthday a couple months later. So you have a big party for them and the family. And then a couple months later, you get a call that they found the person.
Oh,
and
wow.
That's
do
really
it again.
Hard. You got to do it again, a full out funeral. And then, when they found the guy that took my spot, I mean, it was a toe. And so the family's thinking this is a body, and you're going to this makeshift morgue, which was 18 semis backed up to each other with a tent over it.
Oh my gosh.
And you go down there and you go with your engine and the guys and the family to bring out the body, and you realize it's just an envelope. And so you try and prop up the gurney so that the family doesn't see the reality of it, and then you can't really hide it. And just seeing that's really hard.
It's horrific. It's horrific. Whew. You doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. It's
okay. Mike, are you still a firefighter in New York or anywhere?
No, not. I live in Florida, and I sell real estate. I got a real estate team.
So can you just tell us a little bit about your decision to step away from the fire department?
Sure. That was just kind of traumatic going through all that whole year.
Yeah.
It's really hard. And I wrestled with the fact that I knew I didn't want to live in New York the rest of my life, but I loved the job. And I don't know if it was trauma. I don't know what it was, but eventually I took a leave of absence to kind of clear my head and see what was going on outside and just get a little bit of break. I knew that if I was going to live the life that I wanted to live, I was going to have to make the decisions that would support that. And so one of it, unfortunately, I just realized with New York, living up there, it just probably wasn't the best for me. And I don't know, looking back now, I don't know if part of it was trying to get away from, because that loss was there in front of you all the time. I mean,
it never goes away.
The end of 9/11, you became a tourist spot, essentially. Tourists come by and really want to express empathy. I mean, everybody was so overwhelmingly generous, kind. They brought gifts. They really just cried with us. And so I just took a leave of absence and eventually stayed down in Florida.
Yeah. I can understand that. Do you keep in touch with other first responders? Is that common? Did a lot of folks decide that they couldn't keep going?
I definitely do. I still keep in contact with the guys from the firehouse. And I'll call them every September 11th and just kind of see which family members showed up. And if I go up to New York, I'll visit them. But they are monitoring us too because of our health and what we were exposed to down there. Unfortunately, with one day of being even just that first day and the times after that, I lost about 30% of my lung capacity.
Wow.
And just some other health issues have arisen from that. So, we still are starting to see the effects of how that day impacted us. So they monitor us. It's the World Trade Center health monitoring.
Yeah, and that's been a topic that's been in the news quite a bit lately, is making sure there's adequate funding for all of you for that. And that's one of those things that, of course, makes perfect sense to me, but I don't know that I ever thought about. And when did you realize that you had lost that much lung capacity? I mean, that's a big deal.
Oh, pretty quickly after. We all had to go for World Trade Center medical after the 11th, so maybe several months afterwards. And looking at, I guess, my pulmonology report from when I joined to then, and then looking at x-rays and seeing a bunch of scar tissue, it became apparent. I also had chronic bronchitis and some other issues that were very common, but nothing compared to what a lot of other guys had.
Does that physically impact your abilities now?
It does. And here's what's kind of difficult, to be candid with you. So 2011, I never had any health issues in my life.
Okay.
But 2011, I started experiencing a lot of fatigue and some other issues. And I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
Oh, wow.
And my first thought was all the junk I breathe in there, asbestos, a plethora of things. So it's just been health issue after health issue with that. Now, that's not classified as a 9/11 related issue. They talk about cancers, which thank God I don't have it right now, and lung issues, but there's other people developing other challenges that we didn't see down the road. And so many of these things will eventually, they say, are going to probably be covered under that,
right.
That coverage. So,
it seems nearly impossible to rule it out as a cause. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
We didn't talk about this because it wasn't relevant, but Mike and I met not that long ago. I guess about a month ago at Podcast Movement. We're going to talk about why you were there, but you look young and healthy. And in fact, it makes sense. You said you were 21 on 9/11. Like, you look so young. Well, it's because you are.
Wow, thank you.
You're still so young. And I don't know. I didn't think about that. I felt like these were all like, and I know there were thousands of women lost, but these older men, I don't know why I think of the fire department as,
of course, big, tall.
Yeah, exactly.
And people see me and it's like, you sure about that?
Well, no, not that you didn't look capable of being a firefighter, but you look, like I said, you look young. And I thought, gosh, how can this man's have this story? He looks so young, but you were. So you've lived now nearly half your life as a survivor of this experience.
Yeah.
How has it impacted your choices?
It definitely has played a role in my choices. I just feel such a sense of, I've always had a sense of like living on purpose, but it has increased my awareness of living intentional in everything that I do. And in real estate, for example, when I'm meeting with a customer who's talking about selling their home and they're really processing through this big decision, what I like to do is distill down what's really important to them in their life.
Yeah.
At the end of our life, here's what I think about. The two things that what are you going to remember at the end of your life? What are you going to be remembered for? If you go to a funeral, people didn't talk about how much money they made, or wow, he had the coolest car, the nicest house. I mean, the two conversations that came up in New York City, in firehouses with guys who are like, firemen are not the nicest, sweetest, kindest guys, whatever the case is. They're great guys, but were God and the relationships you have. Yeah. I couldn't believe in Midtown Manhattan, it wasn't anything else. And I'll say one other thing too, what a lot of people may not realize, but the next year that I went to work, we had new people in our firehouse almost every shift because we lost so many guys that we needed guys from other areas to cover. And it was, I think it was like every single shift you would hear some story of some miracle happening. Another story of a guy who said, Mike, I saw what happened running down to the trade center. I just graduated training school. My stuff was still in a garbage bag. And I ran with a buddy down to World Trade Center and I dropped my keys in the soot, and it took me about an hour to find them.
Wow.
And eventually that's how I avoided the collapse. I mean, there were so many stories like that. It was just amazing to hear that. So it could have been a lot worse. And it was horrible, but it could have been a lot worse if they hit, a few minutes later, if they hit lower, if the planes struck lower. But I mean, sometimes I'll be asked to speak at a school, for example.
Yeah.
And I usually start with, whenever I start to talk, we all remember where we were September 11th. And sometimes I have to look at the kids and like, were you guys even born September 11th?
Yeah.
Right? They weren't even born. And what I started doing recently is playing just a YouTube video of the plane impacting at close up.
Wow.
So that people could understand this wasn't two planes crashing into a building. They could see the horrific attack. It was horrible.
Yeah. I recently read something that got quoted. If anybody who was over the age of 10 on 9/11 remembers, like you said, where they were when they found out about it, or where they were when the planes hit the towers. You mentioned earlier that you definitely didn't feel brave that day, that you were terrified, and certainly that makes sense. Has this experience redefined for you what brave is?
It's a good question.
Let me throw this out there because, my work is in helping people understand that there are a lot of ways to choose bravely in your life.
Right.
And when I think about obviously it's obvious that you and your fellow firefighters and first responders were extraordinarily, almost other humanly brave. But I think about the families, the spouses, the children, the bravery that they had to embrace to continue to live and continue to honor. And so I'm wondering if you look at things differently now.
No question. Yeah. When you asked that question, I just, a couple of things came to my mind. Definitely walking up to the trade center, to the pile, was shocking. And there was several instances there that I was, definitely scared out of my mind when thought these buildings were going to collapse. I think one of the things I witnessed is all guys around me who had tremendous bravery. They inspired me that day. Yeah. Other firemen, they inspired me. And then it's like your training kicks in. And then I think, when you think of bravery, I don't think I'm brave and I'm going to go on this pile and look for people.
Right.
The thought of you being able to save somebody compels you to go into a burning building. It compels you to put yourself at risk. And I think there's a bigger why there that you don't worry about how, you just figure it out and you do the very best you could. So, and yeah, some of the families, I saw some of the spouses, they had to be brave, and it's really hard to make a decision that we have to say goodbye to my husband. We could wait, maybe they'll find them, maybe, but at that point they wanted to bury something.
Yeah.
And they couldn't. So I saw, some of the spouses, I saw a lot of acts of bravery in the months and years afterwards.
You mentioned your why. I'm going to save somebody. You're no longer a firefighter. What is your why these days?
My why, especially in the light of 9/11, and I could tell you multiple times of just God protecting me. I was in the pile probably a couple weeks later digging, and we were in some kind of makeshift cave or collapse looking for people. And I get out of that cave and I go to another one. I got out, and that one I was in just before totally collapsed.
Wow.
I've been in fires where, we heard propane tanks exploding. We didn't know what it was, but we couldn't get water for some reason to get up to the fire. And it's just so many times in my life, I just feel like God has his hand in my life. So it makes me want to live on purpose and to honor him with what I do, to be a good father, to be an amazing, loving, supportive husband of my wife. Yeah. And to think beyond. When you go to that many funerals, you things start to distill to the surface, the important things. And so I think, what do I want to be remembered for? And it's not because I had a real estate business or I did this or that, but I want to make sure I'm impacting people's lives in a positive way. I want to make sure I'm raising kids to learn how to be a leader, learn how to lead when they're adults, and lead with humility and to love people. And I want to create a legacy of not a financial legacy so much as a legacy of character, a legacy of giving, a legacy of serving, a legacy of honor. That drives me. And right now we have 4 kids. So it's a pretty big responsibility.
It sure is. I have 4 myself.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about that. I have a child who has autism and as well too. So I have a sense of when you look at the homeless issue, a lot of the homeless issue they talk about is mental health. Mm-hmm. And I realize with him, if we don't give every single thing we have to help him, that's not going to happen on my watch. And so there's a sense of purpose beyond that. And it's interesting how my kids are learning empathy. They're learning to see people not as we think or what they're outwardly projecting, but possibly what's going on below the surface. Yeah. So that's been a really a learning lesson for us as a family.
That's a beautiful thing to say and to see. And I see it with my kids. Do you believe your kids are leading with empathy because that's what you're teaching them to do? Or are they learning that from their schools and the community? or both?
Well, I learned it as a parent. They model you, and that's not always a good thing with me. I'll tell you
You're
that.
totally right.
You know what that's like. Yeah. In fact, I'm just going to be completely vulnerable here and saying this, but there was maybe about a year after my son was diagnosed with autism. So we live in this community where there's a park that's in the center of it. There's always kids playing there. And I took my kids out there on the swings one night, and there was a little boy. He was out there, but he just kept on asking me a bunch of questions. And I mentioned something about dinner, and eventually I just felt like he would always comment on everything. So we came inside, and my son says, "Hey, Dad, did you know that the kid out there on the swing?" I was like, "Yeah, it's a little odd how many questions he kind of kept on asking me." I didn't know if he wanted to come over for dinner or whatever, but I didn't have the best attitude. And my son's like, "Dad, he has autism." And then knowing that I have a son who has autism, I just broke. I just walked out and I just cried. I felt, how can I be so judgmental?
Those are good teaching opportunities though, Mike, to say
they're hard teaching. Yeah, they are.
I judged that kid and that was a mistake and you can do better.
Exactly.
Did you talk to your child? Did you explain to the kid that he didn't really call you out, but that said, "Dad, why are you judging this kid?" Did you, as a parent, the most powerful thing that I can do, in my opinion, is say, "I made a mistake. And let me tell you what I wish I'd done instead," so that they can know A, that it's okay to make mistakes, and B, how to make better choices.
Yeah, we talked about it. I sat him down and I said, "You know something, son?" I said, I learned a very important lesson, and I cried and I said, we learned not to judge a book by the cover, and especially with our little guy, Brady. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I was transparent, raw. I cried with him, and he saw that it was a lesson that we both learned. But that's life.
Do you believe you would have been that kind of parent if you hadn't experienced 9/11?
I don't know. I mean, I've always wanted to live intentionally, but there's no question in my mind that 9/11 has an impact. So I would say no. I would still probably be an intentional parent. My parents are married. They just celebrated, they'll celebrate a 50-year anniversary here coming up in a couple weeks. And I've always wanted that type of marriage. I've always wanted what they had. So, but not to the 9/11 definitely shaped it.
Yeah. I mean, it had to have.
More intentional way.
Have you always been so forthcoming with your story?
No, not really. I would talk about it, but I really didn't want to talk about it too much. And it's not because I want to be careful when I say this, but whenever somebody goes through a trauma, it could become their identity, and that they seek empathy through, I had this happen to me. And and it's horrible. I don't wish this story on anybody. I wanted to be very careful that it was never about me, but the focus was on the families that still bear the marks of 9/11, the bravery of my brothers who died that day, the families that were lost in the Trade Center, the single moms that never came home. And the kids had to, there's horrible circumstances that resulted from this tragic attack. And I was uncomfortable because after 9/11, the firemen became somewhat of a little bit of a celebrity status. You're a New York City firefighter. And I just felt like it could have been on the graves of my, the fallen. So I was a little bit gun shy on that. But I did have a good friend of mine. He was a pastor. He would ask me to speak every once in a while at his church. And he said, "You don't talk about it too much. Why is that?" And I said, "I just don't want it to be about me, like an ego thing." And he just encouraged me persistently to share it. And unfortunately, he passed away. His name was Jim Cummins, passed away several years ago from cancer. But right up to the point of before he passed away, he said, "You remember what I told you? I want you to share that story." And I'll see if I see his wife every once in a while, she'll say that. So last year's when I really started to try to share it more in a way that would basically repurposing tragedy.
Yeah. So why now? Why are you sharing your story now? And when you say repurposing tragedy, what are you hoping will be the result of sharing your story? And I would imagine that it's also healing for you to sort of process it, but I don't know.
It's interesting you say that because I had been reading or listening to an audiobook by Brene Brown.
She's
I'm
one
sure
of my
you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Right about the time that I was writing, she said, I don't know if it was in her book Vulnerability, but it was, she discovered that people who go through trauma, if they write about it for maybe 3-4 times for about 15 to 20 minutes, they heal profoundly faster.
Yeah.
I was at my son's school one day and I noticed one of the guys from New York who moved down to Florida. It's a very common thing. But his brother was a fireman in 9/11. He'd passed away. And I saw him still struggle with it. And it's tough. So I asked one of the newspapers, hey, do you guys, or the local publications here, if they do anything special for 9/11? And she said, no, I mean, we really don't. I said, there's a lot of families down here in this area. They do still struggle with it, and I would love to maybe share about them and share our story so people don't forget. She welcomed it and she said, sure, I would love to hear it. If you keep it between like 500 words, 600 words, and I'm sorry, it's Friday, but we got to have it by Monday. Now,
no pressure.
I grew up in the New York City public school system. I'm a college dropout C student, and my first English paper looked like the teacher slit her wrist and bled all over it. I mean, so, but it's this why I had to tell this story. And this is how I just feel like this is very important. So it's Saturday and I haven't done anything. And I see my son playing in the park with this guy and I never met him. And it turns out he works for a ministry around the block from us. And I'm like, Jaden, who are you playing with? So the guy comes up, says, hey man, he did a great job, and we started meeting and it turns out he's a story writer for this organization. And so I said, hey, can you help me out? And he said, absolutely. He spent all this time trying to help me structure it and so forth. And then I sent it into the editor. And she said, oh my gosh, I was bawling when I saw your story. You want to give you a full page article? Like, just let's get it out there. And she was insanely supportive. But she started sharing her story just like you did. We all remember where we were. Yeah. And I realized that it's not my story, but it's all of our stories. So kind of going back to, maybe I digress a little bit, but where your initial question of like, what do you how has it changed your life? Or what's this new purpose? I want to help people live intentionally and really recalibrate their goals around what matters most. We all remember how we felt. Maybe you went home and you hugged your kids a little bit tighter or your spouse a little bit tighter or whatever. Or maybe you questioned your job. Am I stuck in this job? You kind of made those evaluations about what's important in our life. And so I like to be able to share about the bravery of the guys and let people know that the families are still suffering, but don't waste your life.
Yeah.
Focus on what is important to you. What's going to matter at a funeral, right? And try to live with purpose on things. There's a saying I heard, like, the things that matter most must never be at the mercy of the things that matter least. So when people work their tails off and they're not engaging with their kids because they feel like they got to get some deadline done, and that always happens, or they're trying to climb the corporate ladder. No shame on that, but there's always a cost, right? Is it worth losing your family, or kind of helping people see the balance of that?
I love that.
It's been really cool to kind of see how things click in people's minds and they begin to think, is this lining up with my values?
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the premise of the podcast you want to start.
Yeah. So that's why we met at the event.
That's right.
I'm in the process of kind of creating a podcast, and really for real estate at this point, I've just been blessed to be around some great people who have taught me the business pretty well. And I've become more of a coach to people. And I have a heart to serve real estate agents and to teach them how to serve their customers from this level that I think of what matters at a funeral. What's really, people, when they make may sound cheesy, but whenever people are buying and selling a home, it's never about the home. It's about what the home is going to do for them, how it's going to make them feel, how it's going to support what they're looking to do long term. And so it's maybe more of a teaching them a values-based approach so they could feel good about what they're doing and lead people well.
I love that. I believe as a community and culturally, we're shifting towards value-driven, purpose-driven businesses. If I'm a consumer, I'm looking for a realtor or anybody whose motivation is in value-based, purpose-driven across the board. So I love that you're doing that. I love that you're teaching other people to do that, because that does bring it back to empathy and understanding and building community, which, post 9/11, the number of assumptions of people based on the way that they look and based on what their religion is, and those hate crimes, and even if it's not a hate crime, just a distrust, it's all up, and it's gross. In my personal opinion, it's just gross. I'll never forget this. Here, talk about vulnerability. My then boyfriend and I flew to Oakland for a wedding on October 13th. And normal flights had only just resumed. And it was the first time we were at the airport, and there weren't very many people there. And we sat down, and I'm like skittering and looking around, and there was a young man who had a beard, and he was darker skinned than me. I don't have no idea what his heritage was,
right,
but I kind of stiffened, and my ex said, "Oh, stop looking at him like that. I think he's Mexican." Not that mattered, right? Like, it didn't matter where he's from. He could have been from anywhere. But even I was like terrified. But we're 18 years out, and we are only now, in my opinion, starting to really heal from that fear and look at everyone in the world around us. There are bad people in every community, in every town, in every religion, in every sexual orientation, in everything.
Of course.
There are way more good people, and we need to focus on that. And I love that you're out there helping to heal hearts in that way.
I think we're out there, you too. And if I may, it's funny how you and I spoke before this, and you said, hey, you talked about your Facebook post, and you're going to post some political beliefs, and you didn't care about offending me. And I think, look how great we're getting along.
Of course.
I think you're amazing. I think you're incredible.
Thank you.
And I think hopefully somewhere out there can maybe hear this story and realize that the division in our country right now is just going to levels where it's not like, I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, but we're still Americans. I pray that we don't have to have another 9/11 happen for us to kind of come together and be united, whether you agree with the president or not the president or something. I mean, we're all different. We're all going to have different views, but like, we can love each other. We can be American together. We can find common ground. We can find things that we're united in. And it's great to have another point of view. So I hope people at least realize that, you could talk to other people.
Conversation changes everything. And I would take it further than even just being American. And we have a ton of listeners in other parts of the world. We are all one people. It doesn't matter where in the world you live. And when we start othering people who live in different places because we're afraid of their differences, we're ruining our own lives. We're taking away our own potential for growth and happiness, in my opinion.
I agree. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So how has 9/11 impacted your life, Heather?
Oh, wow. I feel like I might cry. I sat in a lunchroom in the basement of a hotel in downtown Chicago, very unsure. I had loved ones in New York. I had loved ones that worked in the World Trade Center. I remember thinking, oh my God, the world is never going to be the same. Mm-hmm. And I was right.
Yeah.
It's not. It's changed everything. for me, it's taught me to be more patient and to, to come together as a community. Like you talked about the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like, what can we do to support the people around us and not to wait for such a terrible tragedy to go out and do the right thing. Martin Luther King said it's always the right time to do the right thing.
Always. Did you what came up in you when it happened? Did you question, like, did you have kids at the time? How old were your kids, by the way?
I didn't.
Okay.
My oldest is 14, should be 15 in less than a month.
Did you call your family and just have
absolutely. We called, we watched. I just remember watching the TV over and over and over again, never turning it off. I remember seeing President Bush arrive at Ground Zero and speak. I'll be honest. I don't agree with all of the post 9/11 decisions that have been made.
And neither do I.
I think, and I'm not justifying any of them, but I believe that we were so ill prepared for this type of tragedy. It's very difficult to make well thought out decisions under that type of pressure. So I'm not justifying any of it. I wish that some things had been changed sooner as a nation. Sure. I think that it made us a scared nation of people that has made some really bad decisions that have impacted us in a dangerous way.
Yeah.
But we are the people that make up our nation, and we are the people that make up a community of world humans, and we get to decide if we're going to welcome one another and engage and be kind. And that's on us. And I take that responsibility very seriously. And I know that you do as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I
would like to invite listeners. Why don't you answer Mike's question? Why don't you share with us how I don't know what word to use here.
Can I throw an idea, maybe along the lines?
Yeah.
One of the other things that when we talk about repurposing, right? I want to repurpose my story for good in honoring the fallen. So here's an example, and maybe this could be something that your listeners could take part in. Many of the guys who passed away, they were step-up guys. They did the right thing. In fact, the guy who took my spot, James Papa George, he was a paramedic, and he loved his job so much before becoming a fireman because he loved to help people that he kept an EMT bag in the back of his car in case he ever came across somebody that needed help. Yeah. Well, I remember hearing his sister at his funeral one time talk about how there was a time when, before he became a fireman, he loved his job so much that he saw somebody on, I think, the FDR Drive in Manhattan. There was a car accident and the ambulance hadn't arrived on the scene yet. But he was able to intubate this guy, essentially saving his life because he had the mindset of, I want to help people even when I'm off duty. Like, I'm going to be, just like you said, that person who's going to bring good, who's going to be ready to just help people. And it just challenged me and encouraged me to think, when we think about those that are lost and we hear those stories, let us pick up the torch. Let us step up and step into where they left off and keep this legacy going. Let us be the James Papa Georges and be the people who are going to help out. And maybe that's different for everybody, but maybe that's something people could share, is how are you going to allow this story? I mean, specifically when you hear the story, how does it impact you and what do you want to do about it? What good can you do? So maybe that's just an option.
Yeah, you can give us a call, listeners, at 312-646-0205, and you'll leave a message and let us know how you're gonna be one of the people that brings goodness and kindness from a tragedy like this. Thanks for that, Mike. This question that I'm going to ask you feels like a hard question to ask when we're talking about a topic that's this heavy. I'm going to ask you, how do you celebrate? But I'd like to say first that after something this horrific, I personally believe that celebration is even more important. You celebrated the lives of those who you knew we lost that day. You celebrate the birth of your children. And when people buy or sell a home or whatever, like I believe in bringing celebration into every single moment of our lives. So, Mike Cortez, how do you celebrate?
Uh, when you say celebrate, you mean how do I take this tragedy and
I mean, whatever you want it to mean.
yeah,
How do you celebrate things that go well or wins or soft moments or
gotcha.
the lives of those or anything? How do you celebrate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, you don't learn how to handle these emotions when you're in school, right? They don't teach this to you. For the last maybe 15 years before, let's say the last couple of years, I've struggled on the day of September 11th. I'll talk to my brother, and it's interesting how it just comes back to you. I think about, you hear people who have been through a war, and
Yeah,
it comes back to them, and
absolutely.
I just kind of never really, it never hit me until it's me. But it comes back when you watch it on the news. It comes back like it's yesterday, and it's overwhelming. And I've had days that I did okay on September 11th, and there's days that haven't been so
Yeah.
good. But I think talking about when you talked about what caused you to start talking about now, I realized that I want to repurpose this story for good. So on that day, I'd take off, and I just make sure like I spend time with my family. And it's a day, how do I celebrate? I celebrate the things that I do have. I celebrate, and it's not anything material. I just celebrate.
Right.
I have an amazingly unbelievable supportive wife. I've got unbelievable kids. The fact that I'm even here, I just feel like I have a second chance. And for me, I celebrate the goodness that God's given to us, and the fact that my kids, just that I could be a dad. Like, how cool is that? I get to be a dad. I get to be a husband, and I remember the families. I pray for them. My heart breaks that it's still very fresh. So I just
Yeah.
encourage people to think about those people on September 11th. But I celebrate, even just the joy of walking in the forest. I mean, that you have breath in your lungs. And
Yeah.
so
I love
simple
that.
things are precious.
Well, and we're airing this episode. Today is September 11th, and it's a Wednesday. And normally we release on a Thursday, but Mike and I talked about it, and his message, his vision is so important to me, to take something tragic and do something good with what's left, and to rebuild and to repurpose and to be intentional. I shared with Mike from my experience, from somebody who, yes, I experienced it with everybody else in the nation, everybody else in the world, really, but I wasn't there like you were there. But I believe that people, they want to know how they can help. They want to know how they can heal, and they want to grow. And I know that you're doing that, and that's why we're sharing this today. Mike, what's your favorite charitable organization to support?
It may not be my favorite, but it's the one that kind of comes to mind. Tunnels to Towers. And that's a foundation or an organization that supports military personnel and first responders, that this basically supports your families who are lost in the line of duty.
Yeah.
And I think that's critically important, because it's one thing to say, wow, it's so sad that fireman died, or police officer died, or that military guy died. But it's another thing to be part of the journey, or watch the journey unfold months and years down the road,
Yeah.
and watching that family have to navigate that. So I really love seeing what the work that they do.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. They're going to be our charity of the week for the coming week.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Listeners, I ask you every week, and I implore you to learn more about them. If you have something to give financially or time, or like them on social media, share what they're doing with somebody else. Do what you can, do your small part to help us grow in a really healthy and positive way as a community. Mike, would you share your 3 words with us one last time?
Horrific, intentional, and repurpose.
Finding 3 words was a bit of a challenge for you. There were more than 3 words. It was hard
Right.
to narrow them down, but I think those are really good, very intentional words. And we touched on all of that and why those are so relevant to your story. I'm really grateful that you're here and that you have these 4 beautiful children who knows what kind of magic they're going to create in their lives. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing your story with me. I know there were moments that were harder to get through than others. I feel very honored.
Well, I thank you, Heather, and thank your listeners for taking the time to listen to this. It means a lot. It's an honor, and I really appreciate. One thing I'll say that I really enjoyed being with you for the short time we were there. But one thing that I noticed in you is you just had this sense of like not forgetting 9/11, how important the gravity of the event. And that means a lot because it seems like as time goes on, how tragic that event was could start to fade. So thank you for putting this out there. Thank you for doing it on this day. And I just would ask your listeners to be thinking about the families right now who are still bearing the marks and the loss of September 11th.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. It's my honor. And actually what I wanted to close with is a call to action to my listeners and a call to action even to you, Mike. May not be a stretch for you. Last month, I took I took my oldest daughter to see Come From Away, which is an amazing musical based on the true story of what happened in Gander, Newfoundland. Are you even familiar with this? Because I hadn't, all these years, 18 years, I didn't even know what happened, but 38 planes were diverted to Gander, Newfoundland on September 11th, 2001. And this story of welcoming we're going to call them 9/11 refugees, these people who they couldn't go back to the United States. They couldn't go anywhere. They didn't know what happened. They didn't have any information. They didn't have access to their things. This tiny town doubled in one day. And they were greeted. I've done a lot of research and studying since then. And they were greeted with such open arms. And the community ripped their bedding off their beds and their clothes out of their closets, and they made food and they welcomed these people, almost 7,000 people. And so many things happened, but those folks, they called them the plain people. The plain people said that they felt almost guilty that they were so well loved and so well cared for while the rest of the world was experiencing this extreme tragedy. Some people met and for the first time and got married afterwards, like all of these wonderful things. But the most extraordinary thing that I heard was of people walking away and using Gander as a pay it forward. And so what they do on 9/11 is they go out and they do unmeasurable kindness for others. Buy a cup of coffee. Somebody bought a savings bond for a newborn baby. Whatever it is that you can do, make cookies and pass them out. And instead of just sort of doing kindness for kindness sake, it is for kindness sake, but to intentionally say, I'm doing this to honor the lives lost and the lives changed on 9/11. We're paying it forward. Help us pay it forward. So what I'm asking everybody to do is to pay it forward today and always. It doesn't have to just be on 9/11, but especially today, and let people know why. And then let us know. Let us know what happens. Give us a call again, 312-646-0205. Tell us about your pay it forward gifts, because remember that celebrating and showing gratitude is better when it's shared. And we want to remember these folks, for sure, the lives lost, but also the lives altered like yours, Mike, and honor you and thank you as a community.
Well, thank you. And I mean, all the honor goes to the brave men and women that really were there doing extraordinary work to the point of giving their lives, knowing full well that they could lose their lives. And to the families of those lost, I think that's a great call to action. So thanks for that, Heather. I really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to, I'm going to bring my community together. We're going to go out and do it. I'll probably share some of that, but I really do want to hear how everybody else is doing it so that we can celebrate lives instead of always feeling bad. Let's feel good. Let's honor. So, wow, friends. Ooh, I might need to go and have a good cry after this. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting, for building your communities together, for leading with love, Love and kindness are the loudest, most universal language, and it's on us, folks. So today and every day, I remind you to go out and choose bravely. This is Heather Vickery, and you've been listening to The Brave Files. Hey friends, I want to share something really exciting with you. We already know you enjoy listening to podcasts because you're listening to this one, but I'm also betting you enjoy audiobooks. And hey, listen, if you don't already enjoy audiobooks, then it's time to check them out. That's why I'm really excited to share Libro.fm with you. They are an incredible new platform for listening to audiobooks. And by choosing Libro.fm over other audiobook services, you are supporting a local bookstore of your choice and investing in your local community. Libro.fm offers over 150,000 audiobooks via their primary platform, which, by the way, they built with love and from scratch because they're a small business also. They even offer bookseller recommendations for great audiobook options. You can sign up right now via www.vickeryandco.com/LibroFM. That's vickeryandco.com/LIBROFM. And when you do, you'll get one free audiobook of your choice, and the proceeds will go to your favorite local bookstore. Now, check what I just said there. You're going to get a free book, and the proceeds are still going to go to your local bookstore because Libro.fm makes sure that their booksellers get paid even when they give a promo to customers. I've listened to over 20 audiobooks this year alone. I especially love listening to memoirs read by the author, and it feels great knowing that all of my purchases support my local bookstore, The Book Table, in Oak Park, Illinois. Libro.fm. The same audiobooks, the same price, but a completely different story. Check them out right now at vickeryandco.com/LibroFM. Have you ever thought about starting a podcast? Maybe you've had this thought and then quickly shut it down because who has the time? Or you don't know how, or gosh, it just all seems too hard. If you have something to share with the world, we want to encourage you to get your message out. The world needs to hear it. Did you know that 50% of all homes are podcast fans? If you've ever wondered about having your own podcast or how it can increase your business or get your message across, then please join me and the other experts from the Podcast Power Academy for our monthly free Q&A session. It's called So You Want to Start a Podcast? This casual live conversation will help you understand how podcasting can be a great decision, why now is the best time to get started, and how to get into action with it. Visit podcastpoweracademy.com to learn more. You've been listening to The Brave Files, stories of people living courageously. To learn more about the show, find our show notes and full episode transcripts, or to get some great bonus content, visit thebravefilespodcast.com. And we would love to know what you think of the show. You can give us a call at 312-646-0205. Let us know your thoughts on the episode, the show in general, or maybe share with us how you're out choosing bravely. This episode is brought to you by Vickery & Co. Success Coaching. Coaching that helps you maintain a life well lived and a business well run. Learn more at vickeryandco.com. Our music was created and produced in a custom collaboration with Matt Lewis from ML Creative Consulting, a boutique firm dedicated to helping clients identify their unique sound and amplify their brand with custom delivered soundtracks. We couldn't do any of this without our extraordinary audio engineer, Andrew Olson. Learn more about him and check out his work at findandrewolson.com. And special thanks to everyone on Team Brave, from our producers, associate producers, copy editors, writers, and support team. Special thanks to Molly, Mary, Kim, Sabra, and Sabrina. I'm your host and executive producer, Heather Vickery. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next week.